Okay, so hopefully this will sound okay on Zoom. I know last week some of the folks had a hard time hearing, so we've upped the volume a little bit. And if you can hear okay, maybe give a thumbs up to Tony. All right. Today we'll be looking at the history of the church's property and buildings. While the church is much more than this, the hope is that by exploring how our physical plant came to be, we'll get a glimpse into the life and work of the church, its members, and its involvement in our community from its beginnings until now. As mentioned last week, Rowan County was established in 1753. Between the Register of Deeds and the Rowan Public Library, there are many documents and maps that help with following the transactions from the founding of the county until the church property being what it is today. So this is just a piece of a map that shows the two city blocks that we're on. This is a map from a few years after the establishment of Rowan County and Salisbury, indicating the owners of the property where the church and manse were built. We'll take a look at the buildings that made up the church over the years, including those that remain to this day. We'll also talk with some about the transfer of property that eventually became the current church property and the Bell Tower Green Park. Note that each city block shown here is further divided up into four numbered squares. They're referred to in deed records as land changed hands, so it made it easy to go and take a look at how the properties changed. They always talk about it in block number. One of the names listed here is William Nesbitt, who was the stepfather of Maxwell Chambers. In time, he acquired the remainder of that block and later left it to his daughter, Rebecca, who was Maxwell Chambers' half-sister. She was a member of the church and gave the land, lot number 25. There, it was owned by Thomas Frohock, but eventually William Nesbitt owned it. She gave that to the church for the construction of the first sanctuary. She later put her holdings in the square in trust with Maxwell Chambers prior to her marriage to Matthew Shirley. The house, now known as the Usman Chambers House, was built on the corner of West Ennis and Jackson Street for Louis Usman by builder Jacob Steyerwalt in approximately 1850. And I get some slight variations on history in different places on many of the buildings, but this one in particular in terms of the building. But that I've seen that more places than not. In 1819, the house and the property were sold to Judge James Martin, and then later to Reverend Thomas Davis of St. Luke's Episcopal in 1940. Maxwell Chambers bought the entire city block, lots 33, 34, 41, and 42 from Reverend Davis in 1847 for the use by Reverend Archibald Baker and future ministers of the church as a manse and land to garden and raise animals on. So that would be this property here. In 1913, the house was moved further up Jackson Street to make room for a new brick manse, which remains to this day. Dr. Byron Clark and his family were the last ones to live in this manse. And as a side note, Edith Clark was his daughter, and she was the director of the Rowan County Library. The history book that's there right now, but that's very helpful in any research that's being done, was named for Edith Clark. Later in 1913, a committee was appointed to look into the possibility of opening a school in the old manse building in the fall. Mr. O.S. Crawford was elected principal of the new school at a salary of $85 a month. It was decided to call the school the Salisbury High School. A month later, it was changed to the Maxwell Chambers School. Teachers were hired, building repairs were made, including adding a heating system to this structure. In early 1916, the session approved renting the Maxwell Chambers School and what we refer to as the Wren House to Reverend George Atkinson for a school he was operating until his new buildings were to be completed in April that same year. The Usman Chambers House was used off and on from 1916 to 1953 as Sunday school classrooms. In 1953, the house was leased to the Rowan Museum for $1 a year to serve as its museum space. In 2001, the museum opened in its new location on Main Street. The Rolling Museum continues to lease the Utzman Chambers House and provides tours to the public. As I mentioned last week, while the church was established in 1821 under the leadership of Reverend Jonathan Freeman, they met in a variety of places, including a church building that was built by St. John's Lutheran Church on the site of the old Lutheran Cemetery on Lee Street. And sometimes they met at the courthouse as well. And I've been unable to find any pictures of that original structure that was in the old Lutheran Cemetery. I think partly because photography wasn't really established in the way we know it in those days, not until sometime in the 1830s. In 1826, with the gift of land at lot number 25 from Rebecca Nesbitt Troy, the first sanctuary building of Salisbury Presbyterian Church was built. Soon after its dedication, Reverend Freeman accepted a call to be headmaster of a school in Raleigh. During the early days of the church, although elders had been elected, there are no session minutes with any meeting notes regarding the decision to build this church building. The book containing the first session minutes begins with a short history of the church's origin. It was written in 1828, so this is 7 years after the establishment of the church. These notes reference the early members and elders elected, but it was written after the fact. In 1829, session minutes began mentioning the examination of prospective members of the church, when the sacrament of communion would be held, and other church business. All of the session minutes from the church's beginning to its present day are arranged in volumes, but with all of them, but the most recent ones, residing on a bookshelf in the closet at every man's Bible class. And all of these have been, through about 1969, have been digitized, so they're in PDF format now. I kind of had to do that in order to be able to peruse them easier, because these books over here are fragile and kind of the pages are kind of brittle. So that helped that good to be paging through, but they're all available in PDF now, and Christine has a copy in the office. The invoice for the harmonium organ that was installed in the first sanctuary in 1859, and this picture of the pipe organ that was installed in the sanctuary in 1869 are in the history room of our current sanctuary. Choir members, including Reverend Rumpel's daughter Linda, are pictured here with the pipe organ. You can see the original organ was $328.25. The first sanctuary was in use during the time of the Civil War, and as such, the leaders of the church were asked by the Confederate Army to give the bell to the call so it could be melted down and used for weapons. I don't know that they had a lot of say in it, but they agreed to it. But before the bell could be taken down and given to the Army, the church was told to keep it because they had enough already from other churches. The property where the Wren building is located, between lots 25 and 26, was transferred between several owners in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, with Rebecca Troy Caldwell and her husband, Judge D.F. Caldwell, selling the land to the trustees of the Female Academy, who were also elders of the Presbyterian Church, in 1839 for $250. And there's no reference to this either in session minutes, just in partly in Joe Whiteland's book and other places. The Wren House in its early years was associated with education. In fact, the Presbyterian Church throughout its history was always closely tied to the education of its children and those in the community. An article that was written in the Carolina Watchman in 1877 noted that there were about a dozen private schools in Salisbury, but only the Presbyterian Academy was large and well attended. Several of the early pastors of First Presbyterian also have held some position with the Academy, either as principal or teacher. In fact, the first minister, Reverend Freeman, came here specifically to head the school before then becoming the church's first pastor. Queens College in Charlotte was a school that was started by the Presbyterian Church in about 1771. The British government decided that it would not be appropriate for the Crown to approve the Scots-Irish institution that could perpetuate anti-royalist views, so its charter was revoked. The school's trustees persisted, and it was later opened under the name of Queen's Museum. When independence was declared, the school was renamed Liberty Hall, and it operated until 1780. In 1784, the school was moved to Salisbury and renamed the Salisbury Academy. So there's a lot of, over the years, there's a lot of references to the female academy and Salisbury Academy. Sometimes it was just for women, sometimes it was for boys and girls to attend. And so in 1784, it was moved here. The school operated for 5 years out of what is now known as the Josephus Hall House when it was built in 1820 for that purpose. Also built in 1820 by one of the first members of our church and the headmaster of the academy, John Fulton, was a house he intended as a boarding house for young ladies attending the academy. This house would later become known as the Fulton Mock Blackburn House, directly across Fulton Street from our sanctuary. I found it interesting that Rebecca Nesbitt bought what was later called the Hall House as a residence when Maxwell Chambers returned to Salisbury from Charleston, and they both lived there for a time. After John Fulton, who was Maxwell Chambers' second stepfather, after he passed away in 1827, he inherited that house on Fulton Street as well. Over the next several years, the academy operated out of a few other buildings until the brick schoolhouse on Jackson Street was built. After failure of the Salisbury Academy on different property, the female academy was established in what we know as the Wren Building and remained here until the Civil War. In 1836, Susan Nye Hutchison was hired as the principal of the academy. It was a bit out of the ordinary as she was originally from New York, and this is the time when tensions between the North and the South were growing. Miss Hutchinson, however, had developed a reputation as an excellent educator and had previously served as principal at academies in Raleigh and Augusta, Georgia. Noted in a book written by one of her grandchildren, which is this book here, she also had very strong abolitionist feelings and wove this teaching into her lessons. Her rationale for feeling that slavery was wrong was scriptural, as her faith was the driving force for her desire to educate young people. And a quote from the Amelia, New York Historical Society, this is her original hometown. Susan felt compelled to reach out to the slaves in her neighborhood. She would visit the dwellings on Sunday afternoons and read the Bible to them. Even though it was against the law, Susan taught them to read. She taught in the academy in such a way as to not cause a problem with school directors. She stayed in Salisbury for 3 years, and then she ended up going back to New York later on. Most of this moving around was to do the best thing for her children, because she had 4 kids. The Wren Building, sometimes called the Wren House, was built sometime between 1838 and the early 1840s, depending upon which account of history you use. One source states that it was built in 1838, referencing a solicitation in the Carolina Watchman for contractors to submit proposals for the building, according to Joe Whiteley. Another reference stated that it was built in 1843, as the property that was sold to the academy in 1839 was not really, $250 was not enough for property with a structure on it. The reference also stated that there's a brick on the front of the building with the number 43 and some initials stamped in it. I'll take a look all over that building. I can't find that brick. I mean, it's very possible at some point in time it fell out and went on somewhere else. But in any case, there's a lot of very interesting stories throughout all this history. The builder was Robert Cox. He was a brick mason from Lexington, North Carolina. The school did not operate during the Civil War and apparently transferred it to the ownership of Nathaniel Boyden sometime prior to 1871. The church requested to purchase the property to establish a school once again. He sold it to them for $2,500 in 1871. This was the only property between these two blocks that the church purchased. The other lots were donated to the church by either Rebecca Caldwell or Maxwell Chambers. The Wren building was named for residents from 1928 to 1934, Molly and Jimmy Wren. They were brother and sister and members of the church. Session voted to allow them to live in part of the house free of charge in their later years. Prior to the Wrens living here, it was referred to as the brick schoolhouse. The Wrens were in their 70s when they lived in this house. After the Wren house was used as a school and a residence, but before it became a restaurant, it was used to house at least two businesses that I was able to find. One was W.H. and E.E.C. Handley Cotton Brokers, and the other was Provident Life and Fire Insurance. Cotton Company's sign on the building was still there in pictures that were made in the late 60s. This picture is undated, but just looking at some of the cars around, I assumed it was sometime in the late 60s. In a different picture of the same group of filmmakers from Winston-Salem, I saw a Volkswagen van that looked very similar to what I used to drive around in as a kid. Although I couldn't look at any pictures during the period immediately after the Academy restaurant closed, the building housed a pizza restaurant for a time, apparently. And there was a brick oven installed on the side of the building, the L portion of the building, and there was a glass in area where the patio is currently located. I don't think this restaurant was in operation for very long, from what I've heard. The Wren House Grill and Pub was later operated out of this building by Muriel Kennedy from 1999 to 2006. The Wren building is being renovated now as part of the Bell Tower Green Park, and the intention is for it to be opened up again as a restaurant. Some of these dates, I'm sure that people who live here all their lives know a little better than I am. I just kind of have to go off of what I say. There we go.
I went to Sunday school in the Wren building in the 40s, and it was always used for Sunday school space for the church during that period of time.
Okay. So that was after Molly and Jimmy Wren had been, they've been out of there for a few years before then. Yeah. So anyway, the Wren House is just a very fascinating building because of all the transitions that it's been through over the years. From this view, it's easy to see the stages of construction. The initial structure built as the Female Academy was just the building fronting Jackson Street. Sometime between 1900 and 1910, the L portion was built perpendicular to the original. In 1984, in preparation for the Academy restaurant, the second main structure was built in a style similar to the original, except it was stucco instead of brick, to serve as the kitchen and bakery. As part of this construction, the stone storage building back was also built. And I've been by there recently. I think now the stone storage building is gone. So it's part of whatever's coming next. The Session House was built in 1855 over the gravesite of the Maxwell Chambers family, as specified in his will. Some details he laid out were that it would be a brick building with the foundation being the same size as the wall surrounding the existing family burial plot. He stated that there should be 6 feet of clearance between the ground and the floor of the room above. He also stated that materials he had already purchased be used to plaster the inside walls of the building. The 10 graves behind the stone walls can be seen through a lock gate in the foundation on the east side of the building, which is located on the corner of West Ennis and South Jackson Streets. The room upstairs has been used off and on over the years for session meetings, Sunday school classes, and Boy Scout meetings. In 1998, the Session House was restored in memory of Rochelle by his family. He was a lifelong member and elder of First Presbyterian and very involved in the Boy Scout troop here.
I have a question about the session.
Yes.
I started out in the beginners class there.
Well, there you go. So it's a Sunday school as well.
Yeah, and used to go flying by that opening where you could see the graves. We were all terrified. And we were told that the family horse was
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
What do
Yeah.
you think about that?
There's not enough room down there for a horse. Aaron Kepley, who was with the Royal Museum, straightened me out on that a long time ago. So, but it makes a good story.
Scared a lot of.
So there are 10 graves under the session house, not 11. These include Maxwell Chambers, his wife Catherine, his half-sister Rebecca Caldwell, and her children by her first marriage, and his half-sister Adelaide Fulton, who died as an infant. Rebecca's father, Maxwell Chambers' stepfather, William Nesbitt, and his other child are also buried here. There's one grave, that of Anthea Jane Davis, who was not a family member, and the only mention in history documents of how she came to be buried here was that she died while she was staying in the home of Maxwell Chambers' mother, Catherine. The last people who were buried in this family plot were Maxwell Chambers and Rebecca Caldwell. Both of them died in 1855. In February 1890, a committee was formed to begin the process of exploring the construction of a new church building. Charles Weber Bolton from Philadelphia was hired as an architect for the new sanctuary, and the contractor, also from Philadelphia, was W.R. Martin. The sanctuary and bell tower cost approximately $23,000 to build. At the time of the first services, there was no outstanding debt for its construction. The first service was held in the new sanctuary on Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, 1892, 18 months after the cornerstone was laid. Joe White Lynn lists items placed in the cornerstone in her book. This book is sitting here that you're welcome to if you don't have one, from the 175th anniversary of the church. A service of dedication of the new sanctuary was held on June 18, 1893, and the bulletin from that service is shown here. Again, this is just among the many things that are in the history room over in the sanctuary. A number of items from the 1892 church can be found in our current sanctuary or other buildings. The baptismal font that is in use today was given by the family of Ms. Burton Craig in her memory. The velvet-covered pulpit pictured here is in a storage room beside the choir loft in the sanctuary. I mentioned it last week, but in 1910, Salisbury Presbyterian Church officially was renamed First Presbyterian Church. According to Neil McGahey, who wrote in his book, Confronted by Challenge, The History of the Presbytery of Concord, 1795 to 1973. This map from 1902 shows the blocks where the church was located. As you can see, the sanctuary, this kind of rounded looking building, the Wren House here, several houses also that were on the same property that were rental houses. The tabernacle here was a building that was used during the time between the demolition of the first sanctuary and the completion of the second. The tabernacle was destroyed in a storm in 1905. One place I saw it described as a tornado, another place I saw it described as a hurricane. It's strange to have a hurricane here, but I guess it could happen. I mean, there have been some that have made their way up this far. Anyway, it was destroyed in 1905. In the 300 block, the manse, now the Etzman Chambers house, was located facing Ennis Street. So, there are a few other houses on that same property, which on this property we're on now that I don't have any information about, but the land belonged to the church, so there probably were rental properties. In early 1913, the need for a new manse was first mentioned in session notes. In February that year, the congregation unanimously approved building a new manse at the cost of between $6,000 and $8,000. This manse was built on the corner of Jackson and Ennis after moving the existing old manse further up Jackson Street. In May 1913, plans for a new manse were presented by architect John Ernest Ramsey and were approved by the session. After completion, the building committee requested to have the rugs, settee, mirrors, all belonging to the manse furniture repaired and placed in the new manse. Reverend Byron Clark and his family moved from the old manse to the newly constructed manse. While the manse was unavailable for use, he was provided $25 a month housing allowance. In 1961, after Dr. Sidney Yates was called to a church in Augusta, Georgia, and moved out of the manse, renovations and repairs were made prior to Reverend Herbert Underwood's family moving in 1962. Dr. Bob Lewis's family was the last to live full-time in the manse. It was later used temporarily by an interim pastor and associate pastor. So now they're in the 1892 church, I'll call it. And in 1928, the Ways and Means Committee explored the possibility of replacing the 1892 sanctuary with a new building on the adjoining block on this block. The architect employed to develop this proposal was Hobart Upjohn of New York. The cost of the facility was not to exceed $250,000. Studies were done to explore how to sell the property and the square where the existing sanctuary stood, since the new sanctuary would be on this block. It was determined that this could be legally accomplished and remain within the guidelines of Maxwell Chambers' will. The congregation voted against this proposal. Doesn't say any more than that, it just says they voted against the proposal. The rendering of this proposed complex of buildings seems to me kind of similar to what we currently have, 40 years later than it was built. In October 1944, a congregational meeting was held to authorize a campaign to raise $100,000 for erecting and equipping of the Sunday school plant. In 1949, the elders of the church exchanged properties between the two city blocks, so that only the 200 block of West Ennis over there and the manse and the Chambers house fell within the trust. The exchange of like property was approved by the North Carolina Supreme Court in 1950. The building committee, on the recommendation of architect John Irwin Ramsey, accepted the bid of L.S. Bradshaw and Sons to construct the Sunday school building within 400 days of signing the contract for $224,700. Housed in the education building are several Sunday school classrooms, administrative offices of all the staff, preschool, and fellowship hall with kitchen. During the years of the Cold War, a fallout shelter was established in the basement. One room was filled with supplies as suggested by the federal government. In 1962, a study and planning committee was established for a potential new church building. In late 1963, resolutions were passed concerning the construction of this sanctuary with John Irwin Ramsey as architect. And later, the congregation approved the building committee as the church moved toward preparing for this new building. In April 1967, modifications to the size and cost of the proposed sanctuary were approved by the congregation. Later in 1967, the congregation authorized the session to proceed with executing a contract with Wagner Construction Company to build the new sanctuary at a cost not to exceed $772,000. In September of that year, a groundbreaking ceremony was held. Construction proceeded from this point, and on Easter Sunday, 1969, the first service was held in the new sanctuary with a processional from the old church to the new by the congregation. In October 1977, the congregation burned the mortgage of the new sanctuary constructed in 1969. Scots Irish, all right? In March 1969, at a congregational meeting, session members discussed the disposition of some of the old furnishings from the former church building. Pews were distributed to members who in turn each made a $20 donation. A number of other items that had been previously preserved included some stained glass windows and other furniture like this pulpit chair. The Alpha and Omega windows that are shown here are in the stairwells going up to the balcony in the sanctuary. was one other stained glass window that was mentioned as being preserved, but I can't find it anywhere. It's called a rose window. Maybe it was, yeah.
Isn't it in the back of the balcony?
That's not it. That's a very interesting one. There we go. Ah, is it pretty big? Yeah. Well, okay. All good information to have. So maybe it's in the bathroom in the house across the street. I'm about to add that to my notes. I'm not really sure where we got. I looked everywhere. I couldn't find a place for another stained glass window to potentially go with.
Is that what was called the angel window?
No, well, everywhere I saw it had the word rose in it. And there's even in some documents from some drawings from North Carolina. They're in the North Carolina State University Archives. They got lots and lots of the drawings from the 1892 church. It shows one full page of the details of that window. It's either the rose or rosette window.
My mother was especially interested in it being used in the new church. Then Sally Bullock said, you know, you need to look in the attic of the old manse because there's some great big window right there.
Well, we may do that. I may take a trip up there. That'll be the next chapter. All right. So in the early 1970s, the 1892 sanctuary was torn down. And this is an interesting story as well. There are quite a few articles in the Salisbury Post throughout the early 1970s about the preservation or demolition of the tower, with the ultimate decision to make necessary repairs to keep it standing. The contract for demolition of the sanctuary was given to a firm in Winston-Salem, but before they could begin their work, they backed out of the contract. Gary Phillips from the Landis area, who I've done a little research and I found that he's actually a jeweler, or was a jeweler in Landis area, was looking to find an old brick structure where he could reclaim the bricks for use in building a new house for his family. Although he and his brother had never performed demolition work, they entered into a contract to do just that, and they proceeded. It took them about a year to demolish the sanctuary, and they were able to preserve bricks and lumber, which they used in building houses for both of them, one in the Landis area and one in West Jefferson. Once the sanctuary was removed, First Union Bank entered into a 40-year lease on a portion of the city block from the National Chambers Trust. Per reports in the Salisbury Post, a building inspector in April 1974 gave First Union Bank 60 days to repair or demolish the bell tower and Wren House. The bank and the Historic Salisbury Foundation collaborated to save these structures and made the necessary repairs. I saw much more about the bell tower and very little about the Wren House, but obviously since it's still standing, something must have happened to preserve it. The final building on the campus, the Family Life Center, had its beginnings in May 2001 when the Facilities Committee was authorized to employ Ramsey, Bergen, and Smith to develop a facilities master plan to include assessing expansion issues and possibilities. In August 2002, plans were presented to the Maxwell Chambers Trust, proposing a facilities expansion project at a projected cost of $6 million. Session later approved creating a capital fund committee for the purpose of raising funds for the 3-story addition to the facilities, which we now know as the Family Life Center. A building committee was created to oversee the construction planning of the new building. In early April 2003, the architect on the building project, Bill Bergen, explained the need for some slight changes to the location of the new building to match property lines. Later that same month, pledges covering a substantial portion of the cost were reported to session. In November 2003, the low bid from R.J. Fisher Construction was accepted. Estimated total cost of the project was about $5.3 million. In December 2003, grading started on the new building. In January 2004, Reverend Duncan initiated discussions of an additional contemporary service to be held in the new facility on Sunday mornings. On January 15th, 2006, the first worship service was held in Lewis Hall in the new Family Life Center. The Family Life building includes contemporary worship space, preschool rooms, administrative offices, library, and Sunday school rooms. So that's kind of the end of the properties. As we wrap up this historical look at the church, I'd like to leave you with a quote from one of the history documents that I found. It has no author associated to it. So it is, as a river flows drop by drop, or a great tapestry is woven thread by thread, just so the pattern is being woven in our church. One stands in awe as we look back and see how God has worked through people in the past, how he is working through them now, and the incredible things he will do in the future. We'll give him the only gift we have, life itself. Thank you. Any other insights or questions or anything, I'd be glad to entertain it or take some notes and add to my document at a future time. But I appreciate your input.
That wonderful art green as a result.
That's
Paul Fisher once said that he thought it would bring the community together. And it certainly has. I mean, people, all walks of life, all ages enjoy that park. Everybody's nice to everybody. It's such a wonderful facility. I saw something that reminded me of a child growing up in the 40s. It's a large mound, the March Hill. And while on earth, one of the property owners over here said, "Why is that large mound?" And I finally found out why. There was one kid that got to the top of it, and he yelled down to his playmates, "Come and get me." It's a wonderful facility. Mike, that was wonderful.
That's it. I've had a great time. There's so much information available. The history room is just a wealth of information, and lots of other places as well. Like I said last week, if you haven't gotten one of those books, there's lots of them available. These 175th anniversary books. I think she put about 5 years into writing that, and great job. It certainly was an excellent starting place for me launching to look at the history of this church.
Is the McGahee book still in print?
As far as I know, it is. Yeah. I'm not positive if I found it in the library or not. I found most everything online about that. But yeah, it's bound to be. I mean, it's a book. It's a book about Concord Presbytery. I found too many books. I was like, I can't read all this stuff. But I would thumb through and find pertinent information. But there's just a wealth of information about Salisbury and Rowan County. It's just if you're interested in history, it's a great place to live.
May I just say thank you so much for doing this?
Oh, you're welcome.
I can't tell you what it has meant to me.
You're welcome. I had a great time talking to you at the Edson Chambers house one day. I think you told me that you might have been the last person to be married in the old. I don't know, something like that. You told me something about some aspect of that
Well,
church.
no, we were married in 1960, so.
But that would have been in the old church, right? Yeah. So.
Married, the last couple to be married.
Well, part of the discussion that day was I was trying to find pictures of the hut, and the hut is something I didn't include in here, but it was kind of created as Sunday school space at some point in time. It's a little hard to find. Certainly could not find any pictures of it, but I think sometimes people would use it as maybe as a dressing area for brides when they were ready to get married.
Yeah, that's where we.
So the Boy Scouts used the
Of the session. Yeah. And that's how, I think that's how Rochelle's family came to decide to restore it in his memory.
Sub question, is the man's being used for anything?
Not much. Yeah, I'd say probably the pat answer is no. But we had some stuff in there on the 200th anniversary where folks came in and toured it and that kind of thing. It's being used for some storage. Things right now. For the most part, no. It's a beautiful building, but got lots of it. Yep.
The symphony used it as a designer house one year.
I did hear that.
To make money, and these designers, each designer took a room and decorated it.
Yeah.
And people paid to tour, and we thought that maybe the church would buy some of that furniture that was in there and make it into maybe a nice place for receptions.
In the years immediately before the Lewis Hall and all that was built, it was used for Sunday school classes for.
Was management? Yes, I thought so, yeah. I thought so, because I remember I think some of them actually met in the kitchen area.
Well, I don't know about the kitchen, but there's two front rooms. we
Okay.
used and one other one, so.
The kitchen area is where the Krispy Kremes were.
Oh,
Yes.
well, that's important. All righty, well, I guess I'll go over and on my way to the sound booth.
Thank you.